Perhaps sometimes it's forgotten that Jesus raised more people from the dead than all the apostles put together. In Acts 9, Peter raises Dorcas. In Acts 20, Paul raises Eutychus. The apostles raised 2 people from the dead. But Jesus, well, he raised the daughter of Jairus in Capernaum, the son of the widow in Nain, and the brother of Mary and Martha in Bethany. Jesus raised 3 people from the dead, more than all the apostles put together. Now, in the Bible, the word death is often used to describe a person's spiritual condition. In Genesis chapter 2, Adam is told that the day he eats the forbidden fruit, he shall surely die. Adam ate the fruit, but that day he did not die a physical death, but he did die a spiritual death. He became dead towards God and to the things of God. And ever since Adam disobeyed his Maker, that has been the condition of every person born into this world. Paul describes them in Ephesians 2 as being dead in trespasses and sins. Today, man in his ignorance would tell us God is dead. But it's not God who is dead, it is man. Man is dead in trespasses and sins. Well, tonight I just want to turn to the 3 occasions when Jesus raised the dead, and to see that whilst in each case there was a significant difference, yet it made no difference to Jesus. On each of the 3 occasions, Jesus raised the dead. Well, the first occasion is what we read a few moments ago, and that is the raising of Jairus' daughter. Jairus, this ruler of the synagogue, comes to Jesus and tells him that his 12-year-old daughter is dying. She's not yet died, but she's dying. But before Jesus can do anything about it, he is thronged by the multitude, and he heals this woman with the hemorrhage. But as he's doing so, Jairus gets word, verse 49, "Your daughter is dead. Do not trouble the teacher." She's died. There's no point now in Jesus coming to see her. Well, Jesus wasn't deterred. He went to the house. And when he gets there, the crowds are weeping and mourning. Jesus tells them to stay outside, and he takes Peter, James, and John, plus the parents of the girl, into the house. And then in verse 54, he takes the girl by the hand. He tells her to arise. Her spirit returns to her. And Jesus tells her parents to give her something to eat. Jesus has raised this girl from the dead. Now, the point I want to make here is this. In this instance, the girl had only just died. Her body was still warm. Perhaps all the colour had not drained from her cheeks. And it may well have been that someone going into the room might have thought she was asleep and not dead. But she was dead. And the proof is there in verse 54. Jesus put them all outside, took her by the hand, and called, saying, "Little girl, arise." Then her spirit returned. What happens at death? Well, we're told in Ecclesiastes 12, verse 7, the dust returns to the earth, and the spirit returns to God who gives it. That is what happens at death. And the spirit of this girl had departed from her. She was dead. But now at the word of Jesus, her spirit returns. She had died, but now she was raised. Now, in a spiritual sense, some people are the same as the daughter of Jairus. What I mean is this. Though they are dead to God, they are warm. Perhaps they come to church. Perhaps they're interested in Christian things. They would never say anything against Christ or the Bible. They are warm. Indeed, when you meet them, sometimes it's difficult to know whether they are a Christian or not. I remember some months ago being in a service, and a man and his wife came and sat next to me. And when the preacher announced his Bible reading, this man got out his iPad or iPhone, whatever it was, and he followed the Bible reading. And then when the sermon was being preached, every time the preacher made a reference to an Old Testament passage, he brought it up on his iPhone. And every time the preacher made a reference to a passage in the New Testament, again, he brought it up on his iPhone. Now, I was amazed that talking to his wife afterwards, she said, "My husband isn't a Christian." She said, "This has been going on for over 30 years. He enjoys coming to church. He enjoys singing the hymns. He's fascinated by the Bible, but he's no personal faith whatsoever." Warm, but dead. Warm, but dead in spirit, just as Jairus' daughter was dead in body. Well, that could be true of someone here tonight. You're warm, but in your heart, you're dead. Dead towards God. Jesus doesn't mean to you what he means to others. The worship of God doesn't mean to you what it means to others. Others might think you are a Christian, but in your heart, you know you are not. If that's your position tonight, then I would urge you to turn to Christ. Ask him to do for you what he did for the daughter of Jairus. Ask him to raise you from spiritual death and make you alive to God. He's done it for so many here. He can do it for you. He can make you alive. You who are warm, but still dead in trespasses and sins. The second occasion is in the previous chapter, in St. Luke chapter 7 and verse 11. It happened the day after that Jesus went into a city called Nain, and many of his disciples went with him. And when he came near the gate of the city, behold, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the city was with her. When Jesus saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came and touched the open coffin, and those who carried him stood still. And Jesus said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." So he who was dead sat up and began to speak. And Jesus presented him to his mother. The daughter of Jairus had been dead for a few minutes. But the widow's son at Nain had been dead for several hours. The funeral had been arranged. The body had been prepared. Several hours had passed by since this man had died. The body was cold and still. There was no response. Well, that's how it is with many people who are spiritually dead. They're not warm to the things of God. Rather, they are cold. They are disinterested. Oh, speak about the weather, speak about the referendum, speak about the European Football Championships, and they are animated. But speak about God, about salvation, about eternity, and they switch off. They don't want to know. They are cold. They are dead to the things of God. I remember a man I once worked with, and he used to view Christianity as being my hobby. His hobby, his main interest, was the territorial army. So whilst I went to church on a Sunday, some weekends he went out on manoeuvres. He wasn't interested in Christianity. It was all right for me. It was my hobby. It wasn't his. And so he was cold. He was dead to the things of God. Well, I suppose that will be true of most people we meet this week. They have their hobbies, they have their interests, but Christianity isn't one of them. They're cold. They are dead towards the things of God. But notice what we read here. Verse 13, when Jesus saw her, that was the mother of the boy, he had compassion on her and said to her, "Do not weep." Do not weep. The woman was weeping because her only son was cold. Her nearest and dearest was dead. She was weeping. Well, many of us, perhaps all of us, with husbands, wives, children, grandchildren, parents, brothers, sisters, we all have those near and dear to us who are dead to God. And whilst we can share many things with them, we cannot share the one thing which is most precious and important to us. And the challenge is, am I concerned about them? Do I pray for them? Do I ever weep for them? For many years, Augustine's mother, Monica, prayed for the conversion of her wayward son. And for years and years, there was nothing to encourage her. But as she prayed, she was helped by these words of a friend. It is impossible that the son of so many tears should perish. It is impossible that the son of so many tears should perish. And after his conversion, Augustine himself said, "My mother wept for me more than mothers weep for children who have died." Those dear to me, those tonight who are cold, dead towards God, am I concerned about them? Do I pray for them? Do I ever weep for them? This takes us on to the third occasion when Jesus raised the dead. The daughter of Jairus had been dead for a few minutes. The son of the widow of Nain had been dead for several hours. But when we turn to John chapter 11, we find that Lazarus, the brother of Mary and Martha, he had been dead for 4 days. In John 11, verse 38, Jesus, groaning himself, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of him who was dead, said to him, "Lord, by this time there is a stench. He has been dead 4 days." Verse 43, when Jesus had said these things, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." And he who had died came out, bound hand and foot with grave clothes. His face was wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." He'd been dead for 4 days. His body was beginning to decompose. It was beginning to decay. He'd been dead not just for a few minutes, not just for several hours. He had been dead 4 days. Well, as we think of people who are dead in trespasses and sins, this takes us on to another kind of person. There are those who are spiritually dead but warm. There are those who are spiritually dead but cold. But there are some who are spiritually dead and their deeds, their actions stink. The murderer, the rapist, the paedophile, the bomber, the militant atheist spitting his rebellion in the face of God. They're dead towards God, and it is obvious. There's a stench about their words, their deeds, their attitude. But what I want you to notice is this. It was no more difficult for Jesus to raise Lazarus from the dead than it was to raise the daughter of Jairus or the son of the widow. Jesus said to Jairus' daughter, "Little girl, arise." And she arose. Jesus said to the man in Nain, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And he who was dead sat up. And Jesus said to Lazarus, "Come forth." And he who had died came out of the tomb. At the command of Jesus, the dead were raised. And it was no more difficult for him to raise Lazarus, who'd been dead for 4 days, than it was to raise Jairus' daughter, who'd been dead a few minutes. Or to put it another way, the daughter of Jairus was raised from her bed. The widow's son was raised from his coffin. Lazarus was raised from his grave. But for Jesus, to raise someone from the grave was no more difficult than raising them from their coffin or from their bed. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us that no one is beyond redemption. The hardest, the deepest dyed sinner can be changed. He can be raised from spiritual death and become a new creature in Christ. We sang tonight one of John Newton's hymns. And John Newton's biographer says this: Newton had a reputation for profanity, coarseness, debauchery. Sailors were not noted for their manners, but such was the behavior of Newton that many a sailor was shocked. John Newton was known as the great blasphemer. What happened? Well, Newton tells us, amazing grace. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Jesus saved him. And that name, which once had only been a blasphemous curse, now became to Newton the sweetest name of all. How sweet the name of Jesus sounds. No more difficult for Jesus to save John Newton than it was for Jesus to save John Wesley. Well, this should encourage us in our evangelism. No one is beyond redemption. No one is too bad to be saved. Therefore, we should never despair of anyone. And yet sometimes we do. We see a person and we think, impossible. Impossible. And yet, with God, nothing shall be impossible. We sometimes see someone and we say, they're far too hard to be saved. Not true. Is anyone too hard for the Lord? The same Jesus who raised Lazarus from physical death is able to raise the hardest sinner from spiritual death. Therefore, we can pray for all. We can witness to all. No one, however evil we might think they are, no one is outside the grace of God. The vilest offender who truly believes that moment from Jesus, a pardon receives. You, Paul says, he made alive who were dead in trespasses and sins. And if you're a true Christian tonight, that's your testimony. That's your testimony. Whether once you were dead but warm, whether once you were dead but cold, or whether once you were dead and your actions stank. You, he made alive who were dead in trespasses and sins. The testimony of every child of God, because Jesus Christ is still able to raise the spiritually dead. He's able to serve to the uttermost those who come to him by faith. Amen. (433)